So Tom has been really a leader in the field of machine learning. If you know about the Journal of Machine Learning Research, he co-founded it. And he has been a program chair for IIII and NIPS, and probably been in a leadership role for any machine learning organization that you know of. And I guess the first time I've encountered Tom's work is through reading one of his papers, and he has produced a lot of the concept results that we now know in machine learning, and has gone on to apply it in very interesting application domains, which I think we'll learn about today. And without further ado.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, see some old friends, and make new ones. The work I'm describing today is the result of several big collaborations, and the work particularly of three postdocs of mine: Rebecca Hutchinson, Dan Sheldon, who just started at the University of Massachusetts this fall, and Mark Crowley, who's currently working with me. Several graduate students, and two natural resource economists, Heidi Jo Albers and Claire Montgomery, and then a very active collaboration with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the information technology group led by Steve Kelling in particular. So the starting point for this really is joint work with folks at Cornell, particularly Carla Gomez, who launched an NSF Expeditions grant that I'm participating in under the title Computational Sustainability. And the starting point for that, of course, is that the Earth's ecosystems are complex, but we have not managed them very well. And of course, you can get armloads of statistics about this, but these plots here show percent of mammal population lost in various parts of the world. Of course, these are estimates. But you can see that we're losing quite a lot of, up into the 75 to 100% range for some parts of the world. And why is this the case? I think there are many reasons, but I think maybe three of them are, first of all, that humanity has tended to think of these ecosystems as part of the background. So we haven't thought about the fact that maybe we should change the way we think about them to conceive of it as a management or a control problem rather than that it's just something that's there. Another reason is that even if you do adopt this perspective that we need to manage the ecosystems of the world, our knowledge of the function and structure of those systems is inadequate. And the third thing is that ecosystem phenomena occur on many timescales, including very long ones. And that means we need to be planning at horizons on the orders of hundreds of years rather than, say, hundreds of hours. And so I think these are three of the main reasons maybe why we haven't managed our ecosystems too well, because all of these things are difficult. Fortunately, I think computer science can help with these challenges. We can't really do a lot about the first one, but for the second and the third, when we think about trying to improve our knowledge of the structure and function of ecosystems, computer science and allied parts of engineering can provide a big range of novel sensors, and we're very busy doing that. And also techniques like machine learning and computational statistics to help build models of function and structure. And then the problem of optimal management we can formulate in some ways as optimization problems, and we have a lot to offer there as well. So as I said, Carla and I and all the various collaborators involved in this project approach this under the banner of computational sustainability, which we define as the study of computational methods that can contribute to the sustainable management of Earth's ecosystems, and which I tend to formulate in a kind of pipeline model with feedbacks. So the way I think about it, since as a machine learning person I start with data, is to think about it in terms of acquiring data and then trying to interpret that data, integrate it, which I'll talk about these phases in a moment, and then fit models to it, and then from those models try to develop and optimize policies, and then finally attempt to execute those policies or influence the execution of those policies. So I'm going to organize the talk in 3 parts. First, I want to give a sort of illustrative example of a research challenge for each of these 6 steps. And then I'm going to drill down on 3 of the projects that we have at Oregon State University, and then try to wrap up with a discussion of what are the distinctive aspects of these problems that, as compared to all the other kinds of things that we work on in computer science and artificial intelligence, are there unique aspects of these problems? Okay, so the first problem that I want to mention is data acquisition. I'm involved in a project called TAMO, which is trying to address the problem that Africa and also South America are very poorly sensed from the point of view of just weather data. So the top map is from the World Meteorological Organization, and blue dots are weather stations that reliably report data to them. And then, green dots are intermediate, and red dots are the least reporting. And we can see that, not surprisingly, the developed world is much better sensed than the rest of the world. And the impacts of this in terms of improved management of water, improved agricultural crop management, and so on, is measured in the tens of billions of dollars just for the US economy. So, and it's one of the things that seems to be holding back development in the third world. In particular, if you're a farmer in Africa, it's quite difficult to buy crop insurance. And this is because the insurance companies have no idea what risk they're taking on if they were to write crop insurance. In fact, there is one company that is now paying farmers to put out a weather station on their property as one of the conditions for getting insurance so that they can start to gather that data. But the dream of the TAMO project, which is really led by TU Delft, is to try to design a very cheap 200 euro meteorology station and then deploy 20,000 of them across Africa with the goal of making it the best sensed instead of the worst sensed of the continents. And this raises computational questions such as, well, where should we place these sensors? And what criterion are we actually trying to optimize when we think about that? So presumably we'd like to reconstruct temperature fields, precipitation fields, and so on. But we also would like them to be robust to sensor failure so that we could deal with a loss in a sensor wouldn't undermine our reconstruction too much. We'd like to be able to use nearby sensors to diagnose whether each sensor was working properly or not, and so on and so forth. The second problem is data interpretation. And by this, I have in mind the fact that often the data we collect is unstructured image data or acoustic data, this kind of thing. And we need to go from that to some form that we can start to fit models to. And in particular, I've been involved in something where we were trying to do population counting of freshwater stream macroinvertebrates. So insects that live in their larval stage, they spend most of their life living in the stream. And they are a very good indicator of ecosystem health. And the Environmental Protection Agency does a randomized survey of all the freshwater streams of the United States every year. And they pay a lot of people to go out and gather data like this. That's a kick net, and you sort of kick the junk from the bottom of the stream into this net and then collect it. And when you take it into the lab, you get things like this. So these are our pictures of various organisms. These are stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies. And then the goal is to use computer vision to take image data like that and count to species, or at least to genus level. And so we've been working on this for about 8 years now.
How automated is the imaging?
The imaging here you had a person has to pick up each specimen and drop it into a device, and then it settles in the device in a way that we can then take its picture. But actually dealing with the manipulation of the specimens, I think, is the hardest problem in this. There are, on my campus, and I'm sure it's true here, there are hundreds of labs that basically are doing visual analysis of small biological stuff, whether it's plankton or shellfish larvae or pollen grains or grass seeds, all these kinds of things. And the computer vision for all of those, I think we're close to the point where we could have a general trainable computer vision system to solve a lot of those tasks. But the manipulation problem for each of them is unique. And if we could develop, you know, a general purpose manipulator, I think would be extremely expensive. But maybe our hope is in 3D printing of sort of ad hoc manipulators for every different task. If we could come up with a design methodology that could support that, that would be a way forward. But I'm interested in collaborators. Okay, the third problem is data integration. So for an awful lot of these ecosystem problems, we have data collected at a wide range of spatial and temporal scales, and we have to integrate that somehow. And the current state of practice is typically to choose one spatial and one temporal scale, and then either interpolate or smooth the data to that one scale. And in the process, typically losing a lot of information about the uncertainty we have in the data, and it's just then output as a bunch of data products as maps, and then people just assume those are correct and do the subsequent inference. So I think a big challenge here is how can we keep the heterogeneity of this data and learn from it without losing either the very fine-grained nature of some of the data or the coarse uncertainty we have in other parts of it. Then the third challenge, which is my actual area of expertise, is model fitting. So fitting models to these kinds of data. And there's three general classes of models that we've looked at. The first are called species distribution models. And the idea here is just to try to understand where in time and space you will find a species. So how is it distributed? And from that, you might then try to make inferences about its habitat requirements and preferences. The second kind of model, but that's not a dynamical model. The other two kinds of models actually try to capture something of dynamics. So one of them is what's called a metapopulation model. And this is the idea of modeling the environment as a set of patches in which species may move from patch to patch. A species may go locally extinct in a patch, and then they say the patch is recolonized. So it's sort of looking at the sites as being primary and the species as coming and going. And then the sort of dual of that are migration or dispersal models, where you look at how organisms move through the environment. And we're particularly interested in bird migration. So the big challenge here is that we rarely directly observe the variable of interest. We typically have some very noisy observations or indirect observations. For instance, in migrating birds, we don't have any birds that are carrying cell phones, so we don't have actual migratory tracks of the birds. We just have sort of anonymized observations that we saw 34 cardinals here one day, 12 over here the next day. We don't know whether any of those are the same bird or not. And so the dynamics are latent, the variables are latent, and the data have all kinds of other defects. So it's very productive for machine learning people to try to work on these problems. So one example of a state-of-the-art in this area is some work that's been done by a guy named Daniel Fink at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, using data that I'll describe in a moment from the eBird project. So this is a map of the United States, and this bar along the bottom here is a clock. So it's September right now, and then October and so on. And this is something that's related to if a bird watcher went to a place, what's the probability they would observe an indigo bunting. And so we can see that according to, this is a sequence of snapshots of species distribution models, that this species seems to migrate up the Mississippi Valley, and then when it migrates south, it leaves there, but also maybe off the tip of Florida as well, according to this model. But again, it's not really a dynamical model. It's not predicting trajectories or conditions under which birds will migrate. It's more that we evidently have some data that bird watchers in Miami or Tampa saw this bird on particular dates, and that goes into the model fit. Another thing that's kind of fun is that we have covariates in this model for things like land cover and so on. And this bird does not like cities. So if you look the next time it comes around, look at, say, Atlanta or St. Louis, and you'll see there's little holes there where the bird is not found by people actually looking inside the city. Chicago, yeah, Washington. So this makes some predictions, and it was the basis of a big report called the State of the Birds Report that's done every other year. And they try to assess what fraction of bird habitat is currently publicly owned or publicly managed. But that does require making a leap, an inferential leap from the bird is found here to this is suitable habitat for the bird. During the migration season, that inference is maybe a little soft. Well, the final problem is policy optimization. I think some of the issues here is that, again, there's a tendency in the field to assume that the models that we have available are correct at this point, so ignoring their uncertainty, and then solving some sort of, say, Markov decision problem to try to come up with an optimal policy. And so one of the open problems, I think, in the field is how can we hold on to our uncertainty in the model and develop policies that are robust to the kinds of uncertainty that we have. But one example of kind of the state of the art here is there's a guy named John Leithwick in New Zealand, and so this is a picture of New Zealand. These gray areas here are the North and South Islands. The red dots are locations where fishermen successfully caught a species called mora moro, and the blue dots are absences where they went fishing and failed. And from this, then, he fits a species distribution model that predicts the volume of the catch for a standardized effort in these areas, and then uses that to try to prioritize areas for creating marine reserves. And this is where we get into the collaboration with economists, because we really want to take into account the costs of the fishing to the fishing industry of setting reserves up in various places. So here's a priority score where 0 is highest priority for conservation, that really prioritizes places quite close to land, which are also most valuable for the fishing fleet. And here, that's been reflected in downranking some of those places. Of course, this again is a naive model in many ways, so it's not modeling the dynamics of dispersal or anything like this. And of course, the ultimate challenge is to go from computer science to public policy or private policy and actually see policies be executed. I think a big issue here is that very often ecologists and economists are called in at a point where we already have a crisis. We have a species that's endangered, an ecosystem that's seriously threatened. And we have really terrible models and very little data, and we're already asked to start taking actions. And so we need to really incorporate the idea that we're constantly going to be acquiring more data. We'll be able to improve our models in the future. And I'm interested in this question of how we can make our models and our policies robust to both the known unknowns, the things that we can actually put probability distributions over, and the unknown unknowns, the things that we will discover in the future. So, so that's sort of this overview of this pipeline. And of course, there are feedback loops that I didn't mention, but as you're fitting a model, of course, you might want to request more data in particular places. As you're optimizing a policy, similarly, you might ask for additional data. And policy execution itself often requires collecting data. Okay, but now I want to drill down on 3 things: species distribution models with imperfect observations, models of bird migration, and finally a little bit on spatial Markov decision processes. So as I mentioned, we're collaborating with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have this big project called eBird. And the idea is to enlist volunteer bird watchers to upload data to ebird.org. And so they are supposed to follow particular protocols. The stationary count is where you stand still and you listen for a given amount of time or observe and write down everything you see. The traveling count is where you follow some trajectory through an area. And then they upload information about where they were, how long, the distance traveled, and then what species they saw, either in terms of absolute counts or just they saw a non-zero number. And then this checkbox where they say, and this is everything I saw, which gives us some permission to infer that there are other things were absent. And this is a very successful project. So we're now getting something like 10,000 checklists per day on average from people all over the world, but primarily in North America. And this is very valuable data because I think a lot of the phenomena that we'd like to study about birds take place over huge spatial scales. And if you got all of the PhD ornithologists in the world together, they couldn't possibly cover those spatial scales. But by enlisting tens of thousands of volunteers, we really can get much better spatial coverage. But there are still many issues with the data. One is spatial coverage. So this is a map of the US where the bluer points are the ones where we is scaled to the number of checklists that we get from these places. And you can see that this is a pretty good model of human population density. But we have huge areas of the country where we have very few observations, and our models, consequently, are not very good in those places. So that's the problem of sampling bias, and we're trying to, one of the research topics is trying to look at how can we correct for this kind of sample selection bias. Another problem, of course, is that different bird watchers have different levels of expertise. Some birders, like me, can only recognize 20 species, and we do it entirely by eye. But the real experts do it almost entirely by ear. And the third problem, of course, is that even if you're an expert and you go out watching, there may be species present that you're not observing because they're hiding. So your detection is imperfect. Yeah, sure.
Do you get to track the report from the same person over time?
Yes. So the reports are identified. Yeah, unlike the birds. Yeah. And there's actually quite an elaborate, I mean, this is a great crowdsourcing example, and there's quite an elaborate vetting system. So they have simple species distribution models, and if you report a bird that shouldn't be there according to the model, then it gets flagged and handed to a human expert volunteer who then vets it and may call you up and say, so do you have a picture of that or anything? So, I mean, there was a famous case that happened last year in the spring, I think. A seagull was seen in New York City that had never been seen in the Northern Hemisphere. It's supposed to be in Brazil. And so that got flagged and verified because the guy had a picture. And then reported another like 5,000 times in the next couple of days as every birder in the entire metropolitan area went to add it to their life list. So there's another sampling bias issue there. Yeah. Yeah, because there's been some nice studies showing that the probability of detecting a species goes way up if you previously detected the species at that location, or they didn't do this in the study, but of course with eBird, people go look online and see, well, what are people seeing there this week? Oh, let's go see if we can find them too. So there's probably a lot of contamination from that, biasing the observations. But let's look just at the imperfect detection problem for a second, which is the one we've been making the most progress on. So suppose I'm going to go bird watching, and I've divided my landscape up into these cells here, and I'm going to walk along this transect, seeing what I can detect. The trouble is, when I'm out there, some of the birds will be hiding from me, and so maybe I only detect this one bird here in this cell, and not the birds in the other cells. So one solution to that is to go out and visit, say, on successive days, hoping that the hiding behavior is going to be independently distributed. So if I go out on a second day, maybe now a different bird is hiding and I detect a different bird. So if I can assume that, that the actual occupancy status, that the presence or absence of the birds is constant during this period of time, but that I can make independent observations that are spaced enough that they're independent, then I can collect data that look like this, in which I get these detection histories. So suppose I had those 4 sites, and one site is, say, in a forest at 400 meters, and another is at 500 meters, and so on. And the true occupancy of those sites, they call it, which is hidden from us, a hidden variable here, is that the first 3 sites are occupied and the 4th site is not. So I go out on 3 different days, and on my first visit, it's a rainy day and I don't get out until lunchtime, and so I don't see anything. So I didn't detect any birds at any of those sites. But on the second day, I'm up nice, bright and early, it's a clear day, and so I detect the birds at sites A and B, but not at sites C or D. And on the third day, well, I'm a little later, and I just detect this bird at site A. So we talk about these detection histories like a 011 detection history or a 010 detection history. And under our assumptions, if we detected a bird at any one of those visits, then we assume it was there the whole time. And so we can infer that these two ones are in fact correct. And we can get a naive estimate of our detection probability as 3 out of 6, or 50% probability. But of course, that turns out to be a biased estimate because it's really 1/3 that we saw. We actually had 9 opportunities to detect a bird, and we only did it on 3 of those opportunities. So a lot of there's been work in statistics on how to try to separate this all zeros history from this all zeros history. Perhaps by making use of the fact that we might think that we saw these birds in forests, so maybe this is more likely to also have the bird present because it's a forest site as well. So a guy named Darrell McKenzie and colleagues that work at the USGS developed this model, which is called in the literature the occupancy model, but it should be called the occupancy detection model. It's really about detection. And the idea here as a graphical model is that the outer plate is we have big M sites, I equals 1 to M, and in each site there's this variable x sub I, which is some set of features, elevation and forest, say, cover. And we observe that, but then there's this variable zi, which is the true occupancy status of that site, occupied or not, so 0 or 1. And we're going to assume the model here is that it is a Bernoulli random variable whose probability of being true is O sub I, the occupancy probability of that site. And so the model we really want to learn is this function f of xi, which is the probability of occupying the site given the features of the site. That is our species distribution model. The inner plate here is as our big T visits to each site. And each time we make a visit, there's some properties of that visit, WIT, like the time of day and the weather, and maybe my expertise. And then that leads to a detection probability. And so we assume that we're going to report YIT is 1 if we saw the bird there. We'll report that with probability Z times DIT. So this is a way of saying if Z is 0, we will not falsely detect the bird. So no hallucinations. But if Z is 1, then we will report it with probability DIT. And so we'll talk about our detection model is this model G that's a function of the detection covariates at the site. And so, in the literature, sometimes these are just treated as constants, constant occupancy probability or constant detection probability. Sometimes they're treated as logistic regressions, so log linear models. And we might say that, that there's some linear combination of the features that determines the log odds of the bird being present, and some other combination of the detection features that determines my probability of detecting it. And then these can be fit by maximum likelihood in a fairly direct way. But a problem with using log linear models is what happens if there are nonlinearities or complex relationships, interactions occurring. If you think about a lot of the problems in ecology, the assumption is that it's more like there's some preferred range, and if it's too high or too low, too hot or too cold, then the bird won't be there. So this kind of linear response requires some careful engineering of the features to cause it to discover things like that. And so to illustrate that, we designed a synthetic bird species for which we knew the right answer. Doing research on latent variable models is very hard because you don't actually have the right answer in your data at all. So we designed a synthetic species using the actual data from eBird for the observation data. And then we fit this model with the logistic regressions to it. And what you see is these are the true occupancy probabilities along the horizontal axis, and these are the predicted probabilities along the vertical axis. And we have a lot of dispersion vertically here, where we're predicting way too high or way too low, right? Everything should be on this diagonal line. Each of these corresponds to one site where the bird was or was not present. And the difficulty here is that because we put nonlinearities into the model, very reasonable ones, the linear model can't do a very good job. Another thing that's been very popular, probably the most popular, well, one of the two most popular species distribution modeling techniques is based on a an R package called, what's it called, GBM, which is boosted regression trees. So Jerry Friedman in 2000 published a paper in which he showed how he developed a particular kind of a boosting algorithm for decision trees, or regression trees actually, where you can wrap them inside just about any exponential family model. So in particular, you can set up that the log odds, you can set up a logistic regression basically, where you're learning a weighted combination of trees, regression trees. And they can be fit by functional gradient descent algorithm, which is basically quite similar to the eta boost algorithm. And so with my postdoc, Rebecca Hutchinson, we thought, well, backing up a second. So there was a big study a few years ago that came out of an NCEAS working group where they did a bake-off comparing about 7 different sort of new generation machine learning techniques for doing species distribution modeling. And this particular strategy was one of the top performers. And of course, one of the advantages of this is not a latent variable model, but it is a flexible machine learning model that lets us vary the complexity of the model to the complexity of the data and the amount of data that we have available. And of course, because these are regression trees, they can discover interactions and nonlinearities because every path through the tree is actually an interaction between variables. And then the final advantage of these is that they're very easy to use right out of the box because, again, tree methods only take advantage of the fact that the values of a variable are ordered. They don't assume that that there's a linearity there or any kind of Gaussian distribution. As long as you can say something is less than or equal to a threshold, that's all you need. So if we fit these models to our data, what we see, of course, is that they're systematically biased, so that when the true occupancy probability is 0.6 or 0.8, the actual detected occupancies are going to be much lower, like 0.4 or 0.5. And so the model has to, in order to fit it's fitting to the detected detections rather than to the underlying true variable. So it has to underestimate those things. And curiously, it has to actually overestimate at the low end in order to accommodate that. So, this is really an illustration of a larger tension in machine learning and statistics. Leo Breiman calls it the 2 cultures of statistics. In machine learning, we don't really have a name for this, but there's one whole family of methods in machine learning, right, that's based on probabilistic graphical models. And we love them because we can write down all kinds of our domain knowledge in structuring the model. We can have latent variables in the model, and so on. But the other family of machine learning models, which Leo Breiman calls algorithmic techniques, are flexible non-parametric methods. So all the tree methods, ensemble methods, support vector machines, all of these things, there's not really a probabilistic model underlying them. They just work really well. But one of their big disadvantages is that they don't support latent variables. They were really inspired by the idea that we want to learn a function from x to y, given x predict y. Which these models don't have that disadvantage, but the disadvantage here is that they require a lot more expertise to apply successfully. Yeah?
I just wanted to check again on the last point on the previous slide. So you're saying when I can use my latent graphical model, I can write down the generative process for detection,
right,
and therefore I can handle the bias and the sampling, whereas the previous slide was showing the problem is that it's just trying to directly fit the under observation.
Right, and so it's fitting something that is actually proportional to the true occupancy, but wrong.
The bias.
Yeah, yeah. And so so often we ignore that problem, but in a lot of these ecological problems, the real phenomena of interest are those latent variables. So we care deeply about them. If we use a probabilistic graphical model, the main challenge, I think, is that these tend to have fixed complexity. And so, because there's a fixed number of parameters. So they'll either underfit or overfit. Underfitting if they're too simple, overfitting if they're too complex and you're just doing maximum likelihood estimation. Obviously, we have a whole bag of tricks for preventing overfitting, but yeah.
Question. Geography seems to be missing from the model, so you're not looking at the neighbors of your parent cell? Is it because
That's
it's
correct.
teleport, or is it for the complexity?
To limit the complexity and also actually using full-up spatial models for species distribution modeling is very controversial, surprisingly, among the ecologists. They feel like if I can predict that a bird is present here sort of just because it's nearby some other place, I'm not getting at the real causal variables. The causal variable should be something about the habitat right there. But I think a proper treatment does need to take space into account. In particular, I pointed out earlier we have this difficulty that we don't have very many observations up in North Dakota. But even when we do, when you have a negative observation that says, I did not see this bird in Colorado, that's not very meaningful if there are no birds even within 500 miles of Colorado, right? It could be perfect habitat for the bird, it's just that no bird ever wandered in there and discovered it. And so if you treat those as negative examples, you will confuse your model. And so I think, whereas if you have two sites right next to each other and the birds all preferred the one and not the other, they had a chance to look it over, and so you're seeing a real preference there. So I think it matters. And I had a student try to prove this. We weren't very successful with the Eber data, but anyway, yes.
So in this case, by latent variables, you just mean the information model is the information missing.
Right, this hidden variable of the true occupancy. Yeah, in this case, when we see it, we believe we observe it, but of course we miss it a lot of the time.
The information, two sides.
Right.
By latent variables, the only thing what model is complex.
Right, yes. So my dream, and this is shared by many people in the machine learning community, is we would like to find a modeling methodology that will give us the advantages of both of these. Both the advantages of the expressive power and interpretability of probabilistic graphical models and the flexibility and sort of ease of use of the flexible non-parametric methods. This is quite a tricky thing to do, though, because the reason you can fit a hidden variable model is because the model is not too flexible, because it's the constraints the model imposes on the data that lets you make inferences about the missing variables. So it's a tricky game, but this is what we're trying to achieve. And so we pursued the following simple idea, which was let's take those two functions f and g in the occupancy model and model those as logistic regressions. In terms of as boosted regression trees, I should say. And this just involves being able to perform functional gradient descent simultaneously on both of these functions. And so that's what we've got that working. But there are a lot of other strategies that are being applied in the field. There are things like kernel logistic regression, which could be used instead and would also be very flexible. If you're purely a graphical models person, then you might go down the path of non-parametric Bayesian techniques. And then if you're a purely kernels person, you might go the other way and say, how can I embed probability distributions in reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces? And so people have been doing that too. So here are our results, where we're using boosted regression trees, but in this occupancy detection latent variable model. And we can see that here, we're doing a reasonably good job, especially if you ignore that one data point, a few of the other ones. But generally, we're on the diagonal. So we've been able to handle the nonlinearities that are in this data, but also correct for the biases due to imperfect detection. And so we had this in AAAI 2010. Here's one of the ways, one of the problems with ensemble methods in general is interpreting them. How can you see what's going on? But this is a representation that Jerry Friedman invented called the partial dependence plot, in which you vary one variable and see what the trees predict, what the ensemble predicts. And so this is comparing the four different models. So this is supervised logistic regression, the occupancy model with logistic regressions, and then the gold one is our detection model with boosted regression trees, and the green one is the one I didn't show, which is, the green one is one I did show, which is just boosted trees, treating it as a supervised learning problem. And we can see that this model predicts that there's a peak of detectability. So this is the probability this is our detection probability. there's a peak early in the day, and then maybe another smaller peak in the late afternoon. And so it gives you a sense of, and this is for real data, not for our made-up data. And you can see that that's different than, say, if you use these linear models, of course, then you have to get a monotonic response here, which would just say, you should go out at 2 a.m. because that's the peak time of detection right here. Right. Yeah?
Is there an issue having to do with how you're generating the synthetic data that does or doesn't all match the assumptions of the model that you're trying to test?
Well, I mean, this is with real data. I mean, with the synthetic data, we use real covariates, and then we basically, our bird watchers had told us that they think there's this pattern. So in our synthetic data, we had like a sine wave with 2 peaks. So we were trying to do reasonable things. But, I mean, it is made up data, so. It was real covariates. And then we've also done some work on trying to handle differential expertise among different observers. So we add this other box to the model that has some features of each bird watcher, like how many years they've been joined eBird and how many different species they've ever reported and things like this. And then that lets us infer this latent expert-novice observer variable, and then we have that influence the detection model as well. Interestingly, we also had to elaborate this to deal with false detections and as well as misdetections. So we found that we had to do that for the expert birders. It seems that they sometimes have an elevated probability of reporting a bird that wasn't there because they don't care about that bird. And one of the guys said, let's see, it wants to know, did I see a robin? Probably. Yeah.
Do you have for the individuals that are co-located and spatial reading that information?
We could try to use that. Yeah, I mean, they have there is one protocol for eBird where you went birding with someone else, yeah, and you're either reporting your list together. Those would be too correlated. But we can, I mean, the way we're fitting this model here is exactly to say, during the breeding season, where we can assume that occupancy is pretty stationary, did multiple people go visit the same place within a short period of time? And we're treating that as, in some cases we might have 8 visits to the same place over a period of a few days. So that's how we're getting our multiple visits here. It'd be interesting to ask, though, could we fit this kind of model when things were non-stationary? So the occupancy model, as I described it, I don't know if I can find the slide here, but right, it assumes that Zi is drawn once, and then we get to T chances to observe it. But with the eBird data in general, Zi, I mean, it could be changing with time. And so people do attempt to turn this into a hidden Markov model where now there's a edge from this to another copy of the model at a different time step, and then try to learn something about the dynamics. And that would take us into migration models and dynamical models, which would be a great thing to do. But now I'm really should catch up here. So this is just a plot showing that for very common, easy to detect birds, there was no difference between experts and novices in terms of their detection probabilities. Except here, experts were maybe a little less likely to report northern cardinals. I mean, come on. It's the most detectable bird we have. But then for hard to detect birds, the experts have a much elevated probability of detection according to our model. So we think we're actually measuring something real here. Okay, well, let me now look at our models of bird migration. So as I mentioned, we're using eBird data primarily. Our goal, we have a project called Birdcast, and our goal is to develop a continent-scale bird migration model. And we're trying to, ultimately of doing 24 or 48-hour in advance predictions of where the birds will be. The scientific questions underlying it are things like, how does the bird brain make its decisions for when to migrate, when to stop over, how long to stay, when to fly on to the next location, and so on. So there are a lot of biological questions. Do the birds really wait for favorable winds? Do they care about temperature? Do Do they have an absolute it's kind of deadline by which they want to arrive at their summer nesting site? Is it a race to get there? Lots of questions like this. Well, the data we have available for this are the eBird data, but there are also other data sources. eBird data doesn't catch birds in motion, but it turns out that a surprising thing is that almost all bird migration happens at night. I mean, if we could look up and see the birds in the sky at night, we would see millions of birds flying over this area during the peak of the migration season. And the Doppler weather radar sees those birds. So this is a US composite of all these weather stations, and that is sunset crossing the United States, and these blue clouds are clouds of birds that are being captured by the radar. So we'll see it again as it comes across. There's a lot of birds down here already, it seems, but here they go. Of course, there's weather here as well. But it turns out that there is a subcommunity for just about anything in ornithology. There's a subcommunity of birders that are passionate about it. There's a subcommunity of radar ornithology where they stare at these things and they write algorithms to try to pull out the birds. And in particular, they do something called moon watching, where they go out on the night of a full moon and count transits of birds across the moon, and then use that to calibrate the radar data. So this is actually our best absolute calibrated data in terms of birds per cubic kilometer. And then another source of data that we have is night flight calls. So some of these birds give little flight calls as they're flying. We think it probably have to do with coordination. And they seem to call more, for instance, on foggy nights than they do on clear nights. And there's another subcommunity of night flight call observers who put out acoustic stations and gather data and then try to identify birds to species from their flight calls. And we actually have been working some in this area as well. So we want to fuse all of these pieces of data, and our goal is to learn a sort of spatial hidden Markov model. So let's suppose we define a grid over the United States, and we'll let n sub I t be the number of birds, let's say for one species, the number of birds in cell I on day t. And then we're really interested in the probability transition matrix, which is, given that I'm in Florida right now, what's the probability that I'll move to Georgia or that I'll fly all the way to South Carolina tonight or whatever? So, and how does that depend on things like the direction and speed of the wind right now, the temperature, and so on and so forth. So the problem is, of course, we have only aggregated data. We wish that we had tracks of individual birds, and there have been a very small number of studies, mostly with big birds that can carry batteries, where they've gotten some tracking data. But what we have instead is a sort of anonymized data, aggregate data about birds and also this radar data. And the radar data is summing across all species. So the solution that we've developed, and this is work of Dan Sheldon, my postdoc, former postdoc, is a representation we call collective graphical models. And the idea is that an individual model we can think of as a Markov chain. Suppose we're just looking at one bird. We can think of x1 as the cell that bird is in on night 1, x2 is the cell that bird is in on night 2, and so on. And it's one trajectory through this Markov chain. Now we'll create a population of those, big M, say 2 billion birds. And we're going to make a big assumption here, which is that all those birds are executing the same Markov chain. So they're all behaving independently and identically distributed. So I don't want to hear anybody talking about flocking, any of those other kinds of behaviors that are alleged to occur, because we're saying they don't. And then what we'll do is derive aggregate observations from these. So we might let N1 now be a vector of counts for how many birds are in each cell on night 1. N2 will be the vector of counts how many birds are in each cell on day 2, and so on. And so then we're going to, then the key trick here is we can marginalize away the individual birds and get rid of that plate at the top. And now we just get transition counts, unobserved transition counts. So N12 will now be a matrix of how many birds went from cell I to cell J that night. And N23, again, how many birds went from cell I to cell J on that night. Now, so this is what we call the collective graphical model, because everything here is now in terms of counts rather than in terms of individuals. What's interesting is if you can fit a probabilistic model to this, and then estimate the most likely values of the count data, those give you precisely the sufficient statistics of the individual model. And so you've also learned the transition function for the individual model without ever having any identified individuals. We just have to make the IID assumption. 2 years ago at NIPS, we had a paper on how to do inference in this model. So, you know, if you try to do inference in this model up here, the top model, where you have 1 billion individuals, you're doing like 1 billion, you know, HMM forward-backward runs. That would be very bad, because you're having to try to figure out where each bird was. You don't really care about that. You really just need to know where they were in aggregate. But here, here, unfortunately, the problem is simpler, but you still have a very large state, because now the number of birds in a cell could vary between 0 and 2 billion. So you have so you still have a difficult inference problem. And so, but Dan developed an MCMC algorithm for doing Gibbs sampling on these chains. And the trick is, so there's a literature, the problem is basically you have to obey Kirchhoff's laws when you're doing the inference, because so the total amount of birds entering a cell on one night has to equal plus the number leaving has to equal the number that are left at the next day. And a nice factor about this is that its running time is really independent of the size of the population, which is the kind of thing you want. Unfortunately, it's still a bit too small, and so we have a paper under review right now where we replace it with a map inference algorithm. So, I mean, we're doing this for purposes of EM, right, for expectation maximization. And so we really would like to, we really should be calculating an expectation, right? We want to take the expectation with respect to this distribution here of the statistics of the model. By replacing that and saying, well, just give us the most likely single point estimate instead of that expectation, we're doing the wrong thing. But it turns out that it's still giving us very good results, and it's so much faster than the Gibbs sampler that it's really the only feasible way forward. So this is what the model looks like. If you want to introduce covariates up here that you know, that are influencing the bird's decisions, and of course our observations down here are things like eBird observations rather than the actual counts. We're observing some noisy versions of them. So we're using Poisson observation model. And so with the Poisson observation model, then we end up with this distribution for how many birds are reported, depending on how many birds are actually there. And so we make two approximations. First of all, we assume the counts can be modeled as real values instead, which is just fine. And then we use Stirling's approximation for this factorial in the bottom. And with those two changes, then the map inference problem is a convex problem, and so we can solve it very efficiently. And what we find is that the approximation is very good. So exact map inference in this problem via message passing is an order m to the 15th algorithm. So we can only scale up to a population of size 7 on a 2x2 map. But for this, we can see that, that our approximate algorithm is doing better than the exact algorithm for the amount of time we can afford to run it. This is running time is on the vertical axis here. And then when we plug that into EM, what we're finding is that this is our map approximation with EM is able to get excellent performance, whereas here are two sort of online stochastic approximation EM techniques that are having a very hard time making progress on the problem. So our full-up migration model, which we're not quite ready to fit to the data yet, looks something like this. So the top thing is the latent actual birds migrating. And then, for instance, this variable would be the fraction of those birds that are flying through the field of a particular radar station at that moment. And here's what we're observing from the radar. And this would be the number one flying past an acoustic station and what we observe there. And here are the number the next day that are camped on the ground that a bird watcher might observe. And so this is our plan for integrating all those together. And we want to add covariates because the scientific questions are all actually about this bit up here. How do these temperature and wind and so on influence the birds? So I have one more thing I wasn't sure what my timing is here. I have about like 10 minutes more maybe? Okay, yeah, okay. All right, so the third project I wanted to mention is work on policy optimization. And so this is much more about optimization than it is about learning. So we're studying, one problem we're studying is invasive species in river networks. So there is a tree called the tamarisk, or salt cedar, that is native to the Middle East, but has been introduced to North America and also to Australia. And it is a very successful organism, shall we say. So it's able to outcompete native vegetation for water in sort of dry areas. And as a result, reduces biodiversity. And so we would like to find a way to manage this species well, but it's a spatial spreading process. And so we model it using a model where we think of this case as spread in a binary tree. So we have a tree-structured river network, and we're going to assume that each edge in that tree has some number of sites. We call it H, the number of sites where the tree can grow, where a tree can grow. And each site can either be unoccupied, or it can have a native tree growing there, or it can have this invasive tamarisk tree growing there. So we'll note that the number of states of the entire system then is 3 to the EH power. So this is one of the main issues here is that the size of the state space grows exponentially in the relevant parameters. And then at each time step, we have 4 management actions that we could perform in each of the edges of the graph. We could do nothing in an edge. We could go to an edge and eradicate all of the invasive plants. That is, we try to kill them. We could do what's called restore, but it's really planting native plants in all the unoccupied sites. Or we could combine those two. We could try to kill the invaders and also plant the natives. And that's the most expensive thing. So, so the number of actions is 4 to the power e, so also exponential. Now, if you could make your decisions independently in each edge of the graph, this would be a very straightforward problem, right? Really very simple. But the difficulty is that your decisions in each part are coupled because of the spatial spreading nature of the phenomenon. So in particular, let's look at the dynamics of the system. So in each time period, there's first a period of tree mortality where trees die with some probability, a natural death. And then the trees make seeds. And then those seeds spread spatially, preferentially downstream, but there's some probability of moving upstream. And then when a group of seeds arrives at a single slot here, or a single site, then they compete stochastically to see who's going to grow there. So say in this case, a tamarisk tree got established here from that. So although we can write down this model as a dynamic Bayes net, it turns out that it's intractable to do inference in it. There are too many variables and they all couple with each other. And so we can only learn from this by sampling the simulator. And this seems to be, in my experience, true of all of these ecological problems, is that we usually have access to simulators of various levels of fidelity, but we rarely have the transition model in closed form. So our goal is to, in this case, is to minimize the expected discounted cost of managing this ecosystem. And there's a cost for invasion and a cost for management. And we're subject to an annual budget constraint, which simplifies the problem to some extent because we can't imagine doing, say, eradication in the entire river system in a single year. More like 1 or 2 of the edges. So we've been working on algorithms. There's a literature on sort of reinforcement learning for MDP planning purposes. So the goal is, given an unknown transition model represented as a simulator, we want to invoke that simulator, and we have to decide in what states and for what actions should we invoke that simulator to collect data and then reason. And we would like to minimize the number of calls to the simulator to do this. And so in this case, the problems are small enough so that we can actually represent the entire state and action space as a large table. It's just that the simulator calls we don't have the probability transitions for that table. So we're following in the footsteps of many people, including Leslie Kelbling nearby at MIT, in looking at interval estimation type strategies for exploration. So we're going to maintain confidence intervals over, in this case, the Q function. So to remind you, the Q function at a state is the expected reward, cumulative reward, or cumulative return that we would expect if we started in a particular state and chose a particular action. So in this case, if we're in state 0S0 and we choose action A2, what is the expected reward that we would receive if we followed, say, the optimal policy in every state after this one, but having done action A2 first? And so these are our little confidence intervals here. And then from those confidence intervals, we can derive a confidence interval over the value of the MDP at the root, at the start state. And we're using the size of that confidence interval at the top. We want to drive that to be small enough. And when that gets small enough, then we can stop and output the policy that we found. So we also maintain an upper bound on something. One of the things we're doing that is novel is maintaining an upper bound on something called the discounted state occupancy probability. So in an MDP, if you're following a particular policy pi, you can calculate the probability that you'll be in a particular state at a particular time. So at time t, what's the probability I'm in state S? And then I can sum that over to all times t, but discounting the ones that are further into the future by this discount factor. And that's it's known as the occupancy measure for the problem. And so we really care about the states where we're going to have high occupancy probability. And so then, as I mentioned, we use our measure of uncertainty is the size of the confidence interval at the root, and we want to drive that to be small. And so our principle is going to be we want to explore the action that is most likely to shrink that will lead to the biggest shrinkage in that interval at the roots. And we do a kind of value of information calculation. So suppose we chose to explore this action here, this would cause this confidence interval to shrink somewhat by some amount. And we'll have some expectations about how much that will shrink. And given that shrinkage, our idea is to take that amount of shrinkage and multiply it by the probability that we will actually be in this state and use that as an estimate of the impact at the root. And so we propagate this information back to the root, and that leads to shrinkage at the root. This heuristic would be exact if the MDP were a tree and there were no loops or joins of things. So it undercounts things in that case. And so then we're going to explore the state action pair that maximizes this shrinkage of the confidence interval, maximizing the expected reduction in the size of the confidence interval. And so we've been doing this, and we have a paper under review as well, in which we're comparing to one of the nicest existing algorithms, which is by Strell and Littman. It's called model-based interval estimation, in which they also use confidence interval-based methods for exploring. And our algorithm we call DDV, and this is one of the benchmark problems that people use in this area. And so the optimal value is this white bar here. Our upper and lower confidence interval is the area between the lower and the upper, these two blue lines. And the red line is MBIE's result. So we're essentially just being smarter about our exploration here compared to MBIE. But otherwise, of course, both of them have PAC-type guarantees that they'll return a policy that's within epsilon of optimal after a polynomial amount of sampling. So we also compare this against some published rule of thumb policies for invasive species management. So there's, as you can imagine, a big literature on this. But these problems have been too hard for people to solve in the past. So they've tended to come up with rules of thumb like treat the most invaded edge in the stream network first, and if they're ties, treat the upstream ones first, under the idea that if you eradicate up there, then that will deal with things downstream later. Another idea is to treat the leading edge of an invasion. It's a natural thing to think about. And Edin Shad in Queensland has a slightly more sophisticated ones, treat the most upstream invaded edge first and break ties based on how much invasion is happening. And so here are, on our problem, a comparison of the total cost for these techniques. And what we see here is that we're finding a much better solution for these particular problem instances having to do with tamarisks in river networks. But I probably don't have time to do that, so let me click on my skip button here, and we'll wrap up. So I've talked about 3 projects: the species distribution modeling with imperfect observations, models of bird migration using this collective graphical models formalism, and then policy optimization where we're trying to optimize against a simulator-defined Markov decision process. What is distinctive about these sustainability problems, I think, is that in almost all cases, we're looking at processes of spatial spread in some kind of network. We've had some projects where we're trying to help an endangered species spread and occupy new habitat and become more successful. I have another project where we're trying to prevent, well, we're actually trying to manage the spread of fire. We want to prevent massive fires while encouraging smaller fires. We're typically often trying to prevent the spread of diseases and invasive species. And then we're trying to do this, of course, over long time horizons, over these Markov decision processes that are immense because of the spatial nature of these processes. The state space and action space are huge, and where the dynamics are typically only available via a simulator, but can't be computed in closed form. Of course, I've talked more than enough about the data messiness. And then the third property that I think is interesting about these models is that we are optimizing against learned models. And so we need to do more research on models methods that will be robust to incorrect models, to the unknown unknowns. And also, another thing I haven't had a chance to talk about is making these all risk sensitive. So typically, we dealt with this issue of native versus tamarisk just by having a price for invasion. But what you really want is to have a cost for things that have monetary costs, and then maybe have constraints on things that are more like species extinction. So you might want to say, I'm only interested in policies that will preserve the native species in this area, and then subject to that constraint, I want to minimize my costs, something like that. Okay, well, as I mentioned, we have this Institute for Computational Sustainability, jointly between Cornell and Oregon State and Bowdoin College. And we have a website and many other very interesting problems that people can look at. And let me just wrap up by thanking all the people involved. So on the regression trees for occupancy detection models, Rebecca Hutchinson and Liping Liu are the key collaborators. For the collective graphical models work, Dan Sheldon and a recent grad from UMass, Akshat Kumar, and a graduate student, Tao Sun. And then on the bird migration stuff, this is Steve Kelling, Andrew Farnsworth, Wes Hachachka, and Daniel Fink, all at the Lab of Ornithology. And on the Tamarisk project, my collaborator is Joe Albers, a natural resource economist, her graduate student, Kim Hall, my graduate student, Majid Talagan, and postdoc, Mark Crowley. And overall, thank you to Carla Gomez for helping make all this happen. Questions?
You've told us a lot about how the real world inspired and enabled you to inform your work.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us something about your adventures going that way?
I don't know that we have any successes going the other way in these.
I imagine that you've tried, and I imagine that you've encountered a number of difficulties.
Well, I don't think, no, we haven't really tried yet because, you know, we've been doing this now for about 4 years. And so we're just to the point. I guess the closest thing is that there was this project at Cornell on this red cockaded woodpecker. And we were collaborating with some folks from something called the Conservation Fund, which is interested in buying up land for habitat for this endangered species. And the policies that were developed are being used by them to prioritize what to buy. So in that sense, from the start, we already knew who our transition partner was, and they were already taking advantage of this. So that's I think our main success. I think with the Birdcast project, we already have a website and we're already making forecasts, but they're being made by our experts, not by our computers right now. But we're hoping to have some stuff in time for the spring migration. So we've got about 1 more month. Talk about deadlines that you can't change. To try to get an initial we have a collective Kalman filter that's a simplified version of the collective graphical model that we're hoping to have fitted there. And also just hoping to take all of the data that we have and boil it down into a form that makes for a nice visualization. Because we suspect that a lot of these questions about wind speed and temperature and so on might be, you might be able to get a sense of the answer just by visualizing the data and just looking and seeing, well, when the wind shifts here, do we see the birds move the next day? And so I have an undergraduate honors student who's just trying to work on visualization of this. In fact, I haven't had time to talk about that, but visualization is a huge aspect of making any of these things work. Like if we can find an optimal policy for fire management, for instance, unless we can communicate it and understand and show people how it will behave, we won't be able to influence anyone. So I have a grant proposal pending, and where we are planning user studies with stakeholders for this fire problem, where we really want to dig in and see if we can use interactive visualization and maybe even interactive steering of the optimization to help elicit more of the concerns of those stakeholders and try to incorporate them into our optimizations.
On the cameras problem,
Mm-hmm.
you showed your results using the model, but that was in terms of cost, not in terms of effect.
Right. Yeah. So I didn't show like did we succeed in eradicating it, for example? Yeah.
Was your model better than the other models in terms of eradication of effect?
I don't know the answer. That's a good question. Yeah.
That seems to be,
I mean, yeah, because it could be that we're just saving money by. It all depends on how you set the relative cost of invasion versus the cost of the countermeasures, right? If the cost of invasion was too low, then we would just do nothing and save money.
Your general model of data acquisition.
Yeah, right.
That reminds me of John Boyd's work with the OODA loop, which
Yes.
is observation orientation.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
so you're familiar with that. And
Yeah.
you know, I guess this would be an orientation point, what you're actually trying to, what you recognize as what you're trying to measure.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure. I guess our adversary in this case is the tree. So we have to get inside the OODA loop of our adversary, right? Is the claim for that?
I have problems with that.
Okay. Yeah.
Your partner. The process. That makes
Yeah.
it less
Right.
adversary.
Yes. Yeah.
I really like how you set up the whole entire presentation in the broader context of like all of the challenges that are out there,
Mm-hmm.
and focus in on what you were able to do. I was wondering if you could give us a sort of sense of the remaining problems or other kinds of data that's out there that you haven't been able to work on.
Wow. Other kinds of data. I mean, I think you know, one of the big areas that I didn't really dig into was this whole thing of taking, say, weather data, and then using that to do other things. In our migration model work, for instance, we rely on the fact that we're using several of these data products. So you know, one of the things we're very interested in is what's called the green up of plants. Right, during the spring, when the plants open their leaves out, then the the caterpillars go and eat those leaves, and then the birds come and eat the caterpillars. And so what we can see from space is just, it gets greener, and we can see that with the MODIS instrument on some of the satellites that are in orbit. Now, MODIS takes a picture of the whole planet every day. Unfortunately, getting the raw data is very difficult to work with because there are clouds, there's snow, there are other artifacts. And so at Boston University here, there's a team that Mark Friedel runs that is responsible for taking all this MODIS data and turning it into a data product where they look at, I think, a whole 8-day period, choose the best frame from those 8 days to build a composite where they can see everything, trying to get around clouds and so on. And then do a beautiful job of normalizing all that. And we're using that data. But that means that we're seeing like an 8-day smooth of what's really happening on the ground. So we really should be going down to the raw data and using that. So I guess this is an instance of that problem I was talking about of multi-scale heterogeneous data. And I guess one fear I have is that there is no generic solution to that and that every problem is going to require its own solution. But I sure hope that it seems like a critical challenge for computer science to come up with tools that would make it easy to deal with these kinds of data problems and integrate that with our modeling. So that's one. I don't know. I mean, of course, sensors break, and so there's also just the data quality problem for big sensor networks like this, and that's a huge issue. I don't know what. There's so many other problems. I mean, there's a lot of problems where you'd like to test hypotheses. For instance, I have a colleague who believes that the reason West Nile virus spread across the United States so quickly was through the trade in used tires. Because turns out we ship used tires around the country all the time. And of course, there's almost no way to store a tire that doesn't capture water and therefore capture mosquitoes. And so, but just getting your hand on the data to answer that question is really tough. So, I don't know. Now maybe with more and more truck drivers being tracked at all times and more cargo being tracked as it goes, maybe nowadays we could actually get access to that data and answer that question. But it would still be a multi-year effort, presumably. Yeah. So. Thank you very much.